All right, everybody. We're going to get moving on this one because we've got a lot to cover. Before that, lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. What movement? Art for art's sake. Who was the champion that is often pointed at for that movement? Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde. And what was considered his masterwork in theater? That's a novel. The Importance of Being Earnest. The Importance of Being Earnest, which was his last play. He had written 4 plays prior to it. All of them had been successful. Importance of Being Earnest was his biggest success, and yet it was pulled out of theaters after he had been convicted of gross indecency. And so we kind of lost a generation of great playwrights, but he was probably the leader among them. Expressionism, surrealism, Dadaism, futurism, existentialism, théâtre theater of the absurd. All of these modern theater movements we can refer to as what type of theater? Now, symbolism is just the first one of them. It is modern drama, but they are non-realistic. Non-realistic. And so we spent all this time getting through the neoclassics, getting into the romantics, finally arriving at realism, only to say when we arrive at realism, okay, where do we go from here? You know, we can't just stick around here the whole time. And so we started these non-realistic movements, starting with symbolism and then branching out into a whole bunch of other categories. Art for art's sake was included in that, even though it looks quite normal compared to some of the others, especially like Dadaism or Surrealism. However, its plots are just as far out and impossible to control as any of the others. Today is the first day that we finally cross over the pond and we arrive in the United States. And we will talk about who we are in theater. Now, for the most part, let me state, it took a long time for us to create an American theater. The American theater was very slow to develop. Predominantly throughout our early history, our theater was just being borrowed from other places. And so the American theater was made up of these plays from Britain, these translations from France. Hey, these plays are coming over from Canada. And so that is what's making our theater for the most part in its early years. When we go back to the colonial period, and what I have up here should make this fairly easy to follow. Who landed on Plymouth Rock? And please, everyone, pull your mask up. Now, who landed on Plymouth Rock? Basic history. Basic American history. Somebody, save me on this one. Plymouth is in Massachusetts. It was a colony. It was a colony founded by Puritans. Remember, the Puritans that were banning theater and going to war and causing the English Civil War, they did leave for the New World. And a lot of people like to say, well, they left the Old World because they were being persecuted for their religion. Yes, because they believed everyone around them was not religious enough. They were condemning everyone else, and so they packed up everything and they came to the New World. Predominantly, every state in this union, starting off with those 13 colonies, was founded on a religious foundation. Some people like to say, well, Georgia was a penal colony. Well, yes, but it was a penal colony that was under the Church of England, and that had a lot to do with its development. Massachusetts was founded by Puritans. Rhode Island, it was founded by the Puritans who got thrown out of Massachusetts. Pennsylvania, that was Quakers. And so you can tie almost every original state to a religious faith. There's one exception, and that exception is where we find the theater capital of the United States today. That state was I promise you, it doesn't take this much thought. New York. New York was founded for commerce. New York, we have Wall Street in New York today. New York is where everybody had to cross paths to do business. And so New York was one of the few states where, theater was actually thriving, where in other states, theater was banned. The earliest record we have of a theater performance in the United States, you find this little plaque sitting out there for it, The Bear and the Cub, or actually the name for it that mostly appears in records is Ye Bear and Ye Cub. Most theaters in the early colonies weren't theaters at all. They were performed in taverns, in pubs, in lodgings. We did not have these theaters that sat, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people that you're going to find overseas at the time. Most theater settings are just makeshift stages. It was the equivalent of going to see a bar band today. And so what happened with this show? Well, we don't have the play. All we have is the record of the play being performed, and the only reason we have a record of it is the actors were arrested. And so they performed the play. The play was considered obscene, not because it had anything which we would define it as obscene, but because under most puritanical and religious laws, just the actor performing, had people run up there and say, no, you all have to go on this one. This isn't going to work out. And so the earliest theatrical practitioners we had mainly came from overseas, and when they tried to do their stuff, often they ran into resistance. And so theater does not have an easy time arriving. As time goes on, we start trying to move away from using plays that came from overseas, and we try creating our own drama. Unfortunately, our own drama, we basically just imitated what was there. And so the first American play to come out, The Contrast by Royal Tyler, well, when it rolled out, it was just basically an imitation of English plays. It wasn't really an American play as much as it was, hey, look at these plays that we're always doing. Let me try and write something like it so we have something to perform also. And we started actually developing some theaters, but this theater that we have here, the old Southwark Theater, these theaters sat 200, 250 people. There are 420 seats in here roughly. So you get an idea of how small the theater was that we're working in at this time. You're not going to see a lot of theater, jumping up and down. There were theater fans, though. There were people who wanted to go and see theater. And as we moved through our colonial days, more and more theater troupes were coming over, and then all of a sudden everything gets shut down for a while. When the American Revolution broke out, Congress basically passed a few acts saying anything that's being done that wastes material and causes men to have to be pick up and move around all the time without direction of the government, we're going to throw all that out for a while. Well, the American colonies can say they're going to do that, but the British, as they marched around, a lot of theater troops followed them because the British continued to have theater where they were going. And also a lot of the framers, Jefferson, Washington, they were big fans of theater. And so when they did find a theater that was actually going to do something, they found time to go and see the show. Washington's favorite play, he always talked about Cato, which is a play about, how does democracy and politics and power play with each other. He was a big fan of that one. Jefferson, he was notorious for collecting plays. He had probably the largest private library in the United States, and he did include drama with it. And so, theater did have, a foundation in this country's formation when it starts to become a nation and not just colonies. Now, the most dominant form in America we've already talked about. Uncle Tom's Cabin, it dwells on it as we move out of that colonial period into a nationalistic period into the 1800s. Theater starts to gain more and more ground. And melodrama becomes, the thing that we're great at. And, England has their melodrama. It begins in France. But that doesn't mean melodrama was the only thing. We did attempt, our American style of acting, our American style of interpreting the classics. This here is Edwin Booth. Edwin Booth is regarded by many to be the finest actor in 19th century America. He was the high point of our actors. He actually came from an acting family. His father, Junius, was an actor. He had 3 sons. All of them were actors. And so Junius Jr., Edwin, and John. Once again, American history gets intertwined with theater because of these 3 brothers. One of them now overshadows all of them, and that is Edwin's brother John is the person who assassinated the president. The Booth family were the most cherished acting family in the United States. One of the reasons that John Wilkes could get so close to the president in the theater is as he walked around Ford's Theater, everyone was like, hey, there's John Wilkes. No one thought it was out of order because he was an actor walking around in the theater. And so they were watching Our American Cousin, which is a British play. Makes fun of an American who goes back to Britain and is hanging out with his relatives, and they are shocked at his mannerisms. In Britain, they were still curtsying, and you didn't shake the hands of people who were your superiors and stuff like that. And this guy walks in, he's patting people on the back. He doesn't use any like sir or ma'am with things. He's just talking to people. He eats with his mouth having food in it. They're like, oh my God, he's so barbaric in so many ways. It's a comedy, mocking the fact that, we were considered very rough. And of course, in the midst of the play, which by all reports, the president was enjoying, bang, and everything shifted again. Our American Cousin is still associated with this one. And after this, we start to move further into finally reaching the 20th century. It is not until the 20th century that we finally start to develop our own theater. It is not until the 20th century that the American theater starts to be from us and about us and for us. And so it took us a long time to finally get to this point. Prior, like I said, we were just basically bringing things over. We were interpreting things that had already been done before. And really one of the things that made theater explode for us was this period in history. Right now, we are finally rivaling what was lost during the Great Depression. About 10 years ago, we had what many people called the Great Recession. And everybody was like, oh, it's awful. And it was. A lot of people lost their homes. You know, a lot of job insecurity emerged. There were a lot of issues. But you know what there wasn't 10 years ago? People lining up for soup. You know, what didn't exist 10 years ago? Signs saying, keep going because there's no jobs here. You know, just keep walking. We don't have anything for you. And as horrible as it is right now, and we're finally starting to reach these same type of numbers, we have a lot of social programs to try and prevent reaching this point again. When this occurred, there were no social programs. There was no social safety nets. When the economy fell out during the Great Depression, there was nothing. Either you had savings or you didn't. And if your money was in a bank and the bank went under, you lost all those savings. And so it was a global depression, just like today's global pandemic has caused a global depression. But today, we're a lot better suited for it, whereas at that time, things were falling apart. The reason we are better suited for it today are the moves that were made at this time. You know, I shouldn't have to introduce those individuals. Hopefully your history classes have covered who FDR is. And so we elected him in the midst of the Depression. He actually would be elected to 4 terms. And his way of battling the Depression at all cost was to create jobs. To create jobs everywhere, to give everyone something to do. And his belief was simple. If people have work, they have money. If they have money, they can spend money. If they can spend money, the economy keeps moving. There it is in a nutshell. But there was no work, so the government just started creating work. I mean, literally, you know, when you walk around today, what we see in today's world is a reflection of what they did at that time. There are a lot of places in Alabama that have a population of like 600 people. This is one of them. And yet they have a post office. 600 people justify a government building being placed in their town in which the government will constantly operate. Or if you drive around, you run into these small towns that have courthouses that are the size of a city block that just go on and on. And every now and then you find these small theaters in small towns. Well, a lot of this was built under this period. You know, and the reason it was built was very simple. We needed to make jobs, so we just created jobs. And so we started doing federally funded projects all over the country just to keep people working. And so this came under what was called the New Deal. And the New Deal was highly controversial. There were a lot of problems that people were yelling and screaming about. What you see on this table, all these little abbreviations, CCC, CWA, NRA, AAA, ICC, those were all different government programs designed to try and get us out of the Depression. You know, every one of them up there was something to try and get us, you know, to, you know, the free and clear. And then over here were all the people that FDR had to deal with while trying to get it done. And so this great little quote, you know, Frank, are you sure this won't explode? A lot of people didn't want it to succeed. But if you have a grandparent that collects Social Security, that comes out of the New Deal. You know, the fact that you have employment taxes and Social Security taxes taken out of your check and you get to go, oh my God, what are they doing with my money? Well, that comes out of the New Deal. That's also why people were able to claim unemployment over the last 6 months. That was a New Deal program that came out. And so the reason we've been able to meet things today a lot better than this period is none of this existed until that Great Depression. The big program to try and offset most of the issues was the WPA. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration. And their sole job as a government organization was to create jobs. And so that's what they went about doing. You know, if building that little post office we have in town took 6 weeks, well, that was 6 weeks people had work. If building a road that connected this town in nowhere to this town next to nothing created jobs between the two, they start building that road that connects the two. anything that kept people working. But, those are things that we can see today and we still recognize today. There was a lot of work that they funded that we don't see today, but at the time was just as vital. The CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, somebody turning 18, we weren't at war at this time. There was no reason to, run off to, the military. And so the CCC started up where anybody, when they got out of high school, could just enlist with the government, and they sent you basically to a national park to do work. And so you actually got paid at that time. Government programs were falling out everywhere. The Federal Art Project. If you were an artist and you were unemployed, you could actually apply to it. And if the government said, yes, you're what we need, you were actually sent a check every week to keep creating art. And if you did really bad that week, it didn't matter. They kept you employed, because if you were employed, you were spending money, and if you were spending money, the economy kept going forward. And so on this, we had a Federal Art Project, a Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Project, and the Federal Music Project. Our focus, of course, will be the Federal Theater Project, but all of these were vital to this country's recovery. And they were one of the smallest parts of the budget. And when I say smallest parts, we're talking about less than 0.01% of the money that was being thrown around trying to get the economy going was put into these programs. And so it was a remarkably small amount of money. It had a huge impact on the employment of artists and on our lives. A lot of the things that we have today based in art and American history gets their start at this point. Because we funded a lot of artists at that time that after the Depression become very large, big names in our country's artistic history. And so the Federal Art Project, when they take a look, this is actual statistics from the Works Progress Administration for 1936. 49% of the funding was, in the fine arts. Practical arts, everything from photography to sewing, to stage work, i.e. building sets and stuff, covered 29%. Education, they were funding people to go into schools just like we have today, but instead of it being grant-based, it was the federal government just coming in and saying, we're going to pay you to go in there and start working. Miscellaneous, which was technical arts, all of this was going in just to keep people going. This is some of the artwork that was produced on the government's dime. Painting by children under the Federal Art Project. Workdays America, we produced tons of posters under the Federal Art Project. It just kept rolling. Money had to keep going out, and so we actually did some incredible things. No Enemy Sub, posters that came out prior to World War II under the Federal. Free Days at the Zoo, posters developed by them. Just things kept going. New Deal in the arts. The Federal Theater Project was the most ambitious. It employed between 25 and 30 million artists in its short time of existence. That's a huge amount of people being paid by the federal government to produce art. This is the only time in U.S. history that the federal government sponsors art directly. Now, what I mean by sponsors art directly is today you can get a government grant, under the, some arts programs, but there's nobody who says, well, my job is I work for the government, I direct theater. Nobody says, well, I work for the government, I design posters. Those programs are gone now. You can't get a job, like a postman, but happen to be an artist and just sit around and work for the government. It just doesn't happen anymore. But at this time, to create jobs, and you had a lot of unemployed artists or artists who couldn't make ends meet, the government did it in order to keep things going. And so the Federal Theater Project was under the Works Project Administration, and it was phenomenal for a long time. It just raked people in. It got things going. Some of the famous artists with it, Arthur Miller, Orson Welles, Elia Kazan. These were huge names eventually in theater and film. But when they were being employed by the federal government, they were being paid something like $26 a week which was really good at that time. And so if you were clearing $100 a month, you were doing excellent. And, at this time, rent for a month was like, $7. And so you did have money left over after to try and make things happen. If you were paying between $7 and $25 a month in rent, depending on where you lived. Haley Flanagan, we are going to talk about her eventually, but she's the woman they put in charge of it. And so she gets to be Miss Thumbs Up and Thumbs Down. People come to her and say, hey, we'd like to try this in the theater. And she basically would say, okay, here's the money, go do it, make this happen, which eventually is going to run into a lot of issues. And so how large was this? The Federal Theater Project covered from coast to coast. And this is where they had bases, basically. You had theaters that were stable in one place you could go see shows. This is not counting their touring productions. They toured all over the United States. They put on shows in areas where we just didn't see theater happening. They would do shows in towns that had 600 people. And so if they're in Wadley one evening, they would pull into town in a couple of trucks. They would find, where's your town center or your community center. They would set up a stage, and it would be free because your tax dollars already paid for it. And so everybody gets to go to the theater, they get to see the show, and then the next day they pack up the trucks and they drive one town over. And so, the next day, they're performing in Dadeville or New Site. And then they pack up and they move one more over, and then one more over. People who had never seen theater before were provided this for free. And it went everywhere. It was a very big deal. When you heard the Federal Theater Project was coming, they were going to provide a day's worth of entertainment. One of the big innovations they had was called the Living Newspaper. And please put that down. Federal Theater Project, the Living Newspaper. They would often create shows based on what was going on currently in the country. The reason this was so important is that in America at this time, during the Depression, we had, probably our highest illiteracy rate of the 20th century. And so a lot of people, if they did not have a radio, the only way they knew what was going on anywhere was things like the Federal Theater Project coming through. And so it was a huge deal because they would get on stage and they would do small, short, 5-minute pieces about jobs in California. They would do things about food safety that was being implemented on the East Coast. They would tell you about how, they're building dams in the Midwest and there's work there. So if, you're not making it here, you can pack up and make a move there. And so you could find out about all the things happening across the country by going to the theater and seeing what they were putting on. Now, as I said, Haley Flanagan, she was a professor. And when she was put in charge of the Federal Theater Project, a lot of people thought of her as this little woman who was, buttoned up, conservative, very much a individual who wasn't going to venture out of the norms. And it turns out that when she got, in control, she basically said, they're the artists, let them work. And so she let people do exciting or interesting work. She was really into people experimenting and trying things that hadn't been done before. She wasn't going to stand over people and say, no, you can't do this, or no, this is not what this funding is for. Her job was simple: keep people working. Keep people working. And the only way to really say if the program was successful or not is how many people are coming to see the shows. The shows that were on tour were for free. And some of the shows that were put on in the stable theaters that they had put up in Detroit, New Orleans, in New York or San Francisco, Los Angeles, some of them were free. Or at most they may have cost like 25 cents, 35 cents, which was a big deal, but still very affordable by everybody who was, going to go see the show. And so your Federal Theater Project, you had a Federal Circus, Caravan Theater, one of the touring troupes that they had. But one of the things that she did that really upset a lot of individuals in Congress is she would not allow segregation in the Federal Theater Project. And this upset a lot of members of Congress, and it was one of the many factors that lead to it falling apart. But, there was tons of African American theater being produced that was being paid for by the federal government. And a lot of people were upset at that, especially when these shows were going on tour. And so this was one of those things that at that time period really played against her. But, it was one of those things that she would not stand for. And so they did classical works, George Bernard Shaw, Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer, which is a laughing comedy out of English history, Enemy of the People by Ibsen. And so you could go see these shows, out of classical repertory. They did tons of Shakespeare, but they did a lot of original shows. It Can't Happen Here is about, whether or not fascism can ever take over in the United States. Are we going to eventually listen to one person who convinces everybody that they know the way to where we dump everything else we had and just follow them? The American Dance Theater, well, that comes out of the Federal Theater Project. Eugene O'Neill, a lot of his work found time under there. 1/3 of the nation. It was a show about the fact that 1/3 of the nation lived in substandard housing. It was a show basically talking about how there are haves and have-nots. And for about 33% of America, it was definitely have-not. Please remember, at the beginning of the Depression, less than 20% of the American Southeast had electricity. And probably less than 20% also had indoor plumbing. It's not until this period we start to finally move away from that. Perhaps their most controversial show was The Cradle Will Rock. The Cradle Will Rock was perhaps their most controversial show. It was a highly pro-labor show, which disturbed a lot of members of Congress because labor had won so much during the New Deal negotiations and battles back and forth. It was very anti-corporation, and actually the Congress actually banned it from performance. And in fact, when the theater company showed up for the opening night, they were told that, they had a court order against any actor taking the stage and performing. And so The Cradle Will Rock is that show that the Federal Theater Project created that just basically had Congress stand up and say, no, we didn't pay for you to do something like this. They did actually perform, but the court order said they couldn't perform on stage, so they just went into the audience and performed inside the audience, and just had a piano on stage playing music throughout the show. And so, it did not make anyone happy, but it became one of those shows that people still talk about today. And this was being performed in Harlem. As I said, she would not allow segregation. And so tons of money was sank into things like the Lafayette Players, which were a African-American company in New York, and they were part of the Federal Theater Project. And so Hallie Flanagan, when she gets in charge and everything, after about 4 years, she gets called before Congress because they're going nuts over what she's doing. And I just love this exchange that she had. This is actually from the Congressional Record. And so they have her in there, and they're questioning her about what she's doing, and they say, you were quoting from this Moliere. Is he a communist? And she replies, I'm very sorry. I was quoting from Christopher Marlowe. Tell us who Marlowe is so we can get the proper reference, because that is all that we want to do. And she says, put it in the record that he is the greatest dramatist in the period of Shakespeare immediately preceding Shakespeare. They had no idea who Christopher Marlowe was. They were going nuts over the fact that she was, having the government pay for things like The Cradle Will Rock or putting money into African American theaters. And so eventually, things are going to start to finally slip. We have a name for art that is used for political purposes. Can somebody tell me what that is? Propaganda. Propaganda is when we use art for a political means. Now, Haley Flanagan did not make a lot of friends in Congress, so when things got rough, there wasn't a lot of people she could turn to. The Southern Democrats were highly against her. They were convinced that, she was, going to bring about the downfall of America. Conservatives in the New England area weren't big fans of her either. And there are some people who just don't believe that government funding should be spent on cultural endeavors. If you leave this country, other countries have what they call a cultural minister. In this country, we would call it probably Secretary of Arts. And it's a person who basically is in charge of figuring out government funding to promote that country's arts throughout the world. Well, we don't have that. We haven't funded anything, just artistically, purely since the Federal Theater Project. And the problem that the Federal Theater Project starts to have that is going to lose it a lot of support is who decides what they do. And so the question I have for you is, if the government is paying for the theater or paying for the paintings, paying for the art, does the government have the right to say, and this is what you will perform, and this is what you will paint? Government pays for it, so who's in control of it? That's an actual question. That would be a great time to have a bottle of water to wait you out. So who should control the work? Well, if you hire a contractor and tell them, I would like you to put a patio on the back, and you come back and there's a new window and you don't have a patio, you'd probably be pretty upset. You paid for X and you were delivered Y. And this becomes a problem because FDR, who did so many good things, like any human, there's going to be some bad things too. And in no way do I ever want to make anyone sound as if everything is great or everything is bad. But FDR started running into a lot of problems with his New Deal policies. Usually you hear the term NRA and you think, of course, National Rifle Association, but the original NRA was the National Recovery Act. And it was a government body that actually dictated pricing. And so, a government agent would walk into a store and say, listen, you're charging a lot more for that canned food than the government was subsidizing for it. You got to drop your prices. Well, most of us would be really upset if we were selling something and someone came in and said, you can't charge this. And so there were a lot of lawsuits that were filed, and a lot of them didn't go FDR's way. And so FDR actually came up with this idea that, since the Supreme Court and him were always disagreeing, that as president, he had the power to name more court justices, and so he was going to raise it from 9 to 15 judges. And since the president names them, he would be able to put, an additional amount of judges on there in order to get all his policies passed. Well, when the courts saw what he was doing, they were upset, but the Federal Theater Project was basically told, and you will go around the country and tell them that we will create more jobs with more judges. Well, this doesn't go over very well with a lot of politicians who are now running into people saying, well, why don't you, put more judges, and that way we can have more of these programs that can create more jobs. And so for the most part, he started viewing the Federal Theater Project as a tool to use in politics, at which point it's no longer creating just theater, it is creating propaganda. art being used for political means. Probably one of the most successful uses was a film actually made by the WPA called The River. Anybody here can tell me what the TVA is? TVA. I know somebody knows what I'm talking about. Tennessee Valley Authority. You've heard it in your history classes. You've probably even heard it if you've taken economics. Right here we have the Mississippi River, all these tributaries reaching into it. Flooding was a huge issue. Well, the TVA came up with this idea, the government came up with this idea, the TVA, that they were going to build dams all over this so they can control the water. And this would also create electricity to finally put electricity down into the American South. The problem with dams in general is when you stop water from flowing, you change the economics of an area. Somebody had a piece of land that was near the river. Now they have a lake that their land is under. Somebody had a farm. That farm now no longer has water. And so everything changes. Somebody had a piece of crap land that was on a hill. Well, now they've got, lakefront property. There are over 1,000 dams in Alabama alone. And so, Lake Wedowee is created by dams. Lake Martin is created by dams. None of these places were natural. And so all of these dams are producing electricity and whatnot. This was a highly controversial idea. There were a lot of people who didn't want this. And so they put out the river. When you went to the movie theater at this time, you generally went for about 5 hours. And before your movie started, there would be a bunch of newsreels, cartoons and stuff. And one of the newsreels was the river. It ran about 20 minutes. And it explained to everybody sitting there why building these dams would create electricity, it would create jobs, it would create wealth. And it had this great artistic line, poor land makes poor people and poor people make poor land. But, if you allow the TVA to exist and you allow this stuff to happen, we won't have poor land. We will get away from having poor people. It will raise us all up. I would hate to be the congressman who then has to tell people, no, you don't want this. This is going to take away this, this, and this, because they just saw a 20-minute movie that explained to them how their lives will be better. And there's nothing you're going to create as an individual congressman that's going to be as powerful as the river. It was a great actual piece of propaganda. Or the Federal Theater Project touring across the U.S. saying that, extra judges are going to make things a lot better for us. And so all these programs eventually got banned. They got defunded. They got taken apart. The fear was whoever controlled the White House would have this strong arm ability to just do what they wanted with the American public and sway their opinions. A lot of fears that they had, would come true actually. By 1940, the Federal Theater Project no longer exists. It only had about 4 years to its name. In its 4 years, it made a huge impact, and it still stands as the only period that we governmentally funded theater in the history of the United States. Today we have a National Endowment of the Arts. We will talk about that eventually, but the National Endowment is not just for theater, and it does not employ people. It just gives out grants. You can apply to them and say, hey, our theater is doing this, we need renovations, we need this funding. But there's no funding such as, yes, we work for the federal government. We're actors. That doesn't exist anymore. In the American theater, there are 4 major figures you're going to need to know. This guy wrote The Hairy Ape, so you should already know his name. I've talked about him a lot. It was a very hard day. Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, and Edward Albee. When we talk about the American theater, as far as playwrights and drama, these are the 4 names that always reoccur. These are the big guns that you see again and again and again. And if you leave this country, wherever you go, somebody is putting on shows by one of these individuals. Their works have been translated literally dozens of times. And so the first big one up there, of course, is O'Neill. O'Neill, I have said several times, is America's most awarded playwright. He is the only American playwright to have a Nobel Prize in Literature, which is a huge deal. He also has 4 Pulitzers. The Pulitzer is an award that's given every year only in the United States for writing. There's a Pulitzer for music composition. There's a Pulitzer for news reporting, for opinion pieces, for criticism, and there is a Pulitzer for drama. And he has 4 of them. There are 2 other people with 3, and there's nobody who's alive today with more than 2. And so he's got a pretty safe place where he is. O'Neill wrote The Hairy Ape. His career actually, it takes off in the 1920s, and he's going to continue to bring in audiences all the way to the 1950s. He started his career as an actor. He came from a family of actors. His father was one of the most famous actors actually in the United States. His father actually performed with Edwin Booth in a couple of productions, and so his father was very well established. But O'Neill did not have an ideal life in any way, shape, or form, and we know a lot about his life because his masterwork is Long Day's Journey into Night. Long Day's Journey into Night. And all the plays I talk about today that are associated with these individuals have all been argued. This is the great American drama. No, this is the great play that has been produced in this country. And there are many people who will argue Long Day's Journey is that great American play. O'Neill grew up in Connecticut on the coast. And, most of his life he wanted to go out to sea, and he would live most of his life as a sailor. When he came back to the United States, after going around the globe a few times, he became an actor and a playwright. But along the way, he also suffered tuberculosis, which there was no cure for at the time and killed lots of people. Either you got past it or you didn't. And the play, Long Day's Journey, is really autobiographical. The image you can't really see clearly on these. This is in the morning because the play starts at sunrise. It's a long day's journey into the night. It ends a little past midnight. It's a long play, by the way. To do this play is about 3.5 to 4 hours. It's an undertaking. And as you can see in the morning, everybody's looking great and dressed. And by the afternoon, it's not exactly that clean looking anymore. Dad, the 2 sons, they're alcoholics. Mom, she's addicted to morphine. They gave it to her because she had a difficult childbirth. And she's been addicted to it ever since. O'Neill's life paralleled it. He was an alcoholic most of his life. His father was an alcoholic. It's what buried him. His brother was an alcoholic, buried him. Mom was addicted to morphine. Long Day's Journey was his last great play. When he was done writing it, he had a reading of it at his house and said it was too painful. And so he had it put into a bank vault with a wax seal. And he left instructions that it wasn't to be published until 25 years after his death. The last 10 years of his life, he produced no new work. We know today, by all indicators, he had Parkinson's. In fact, some of his final plays, he had such problems writing that his writing gets smaller and smaller until it almost looks like about 6-point font, because the smaller he wrote, the more control he had with his hand. And so, as you look at his career, his writing just kept getting smaller as he lost more and more physical faculties. When he finally passed away, at the time, a lot of other playwrights were emerging, and his last wife, Carlotta, started to think, well, people are forgetting who my husband is. And so she went to that bank, she pulled out that play, she broke that seal, and she gave a collection of his work to Yale University. And so they put together the first production of it, and so O'Neill won his last Pulitzer posthumously. He was already dead. He had been dead for a few years. And so in 1956, he won his 4th Pulitzer, having been dead for like 4 or 5 years. But Long Day's Journey is considered, and he had great names for plays, and great, they were great. Ice Band Cometh, Moon for the Misbegotten, Strange Interlude, Morning Becomes Electra, Wilderness. I mean, the list of the plays he wrote, the styles he wrote in, mass drama, attempts at Greek drama, tragedy. He wrote a comedy, which not many people were writing if they were known as a serious writer. You name it, he experimented, expressionism, with the hairy ape. The guy just, could mold into anything he really wanted to work on. Arthur Miller, the next guy on the list. Miller probably has the leading candidate for the great American play. But there's a big argument about Miller's abilities as a playwright, and that's because his career starts so good, and then within a decade, we don't hear from him again. He lives a very long time. He continued to produce work. But, there's a 10-year period that he was on fire, and then he disappears. But in that 10-year period, he is going to produce what many people will consider to be one of the great American plays. Now, these two plays are often found on the top 10 plays of American, playwrights. The Crucible, which we'll go back to in a moment, but his great play was Death of a Salesman. Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman is considered by many people to be the great American play. And what is it about? Well, very simply, it's about the American dream falling apart. And if you take in American literature, they have spent a lot of time talking about the American dream, the idea of home ownership, the idea, married, children, fence, all this stuff that goes into this idea of the American dream. And basically, Miller's Death of a Salesman says, hold up. This doesn't happen. For the most part, you get a job, you work it for your entire life, and at the end of your life, you have nothing to show for it. Remember, Miller grew up during the Depression. In fact, his family lost everything in the Depression. And so there was no, American dream in the end for them. His father had a business, and then the next day his father didn't have a business. There was nothing to fall back on. They had to move away from where they had lived, throughout his life. It was not a happy home. And so he takes a lot of that, and in 1949, Death of a Salesman wins the Pulitzer. It comes out in 1949, and it is the toast of the town. It is a big deal. He had a few other hits on Broadway. Hollywood Came Calling. A lot of people thought, his work was going to be just as good when they put it on film. But then everything goes sideways, and it went sideways with his career because of this. Now, we've talked about this before. Anybody remember what playwright we talked about when we brought up this committee? Come on, somebody. When we talked about it before, it dealt with Bertolt Brecht. And they called Brecht, and they're like, are you a communist? And he's like, no, I hate communism. Communism is the most awful thing ever. And then he got the hell out of this country and went back to East Germany and ran his little communist theater. But HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities, called a lot of people before them. And of course, that famous question, are you now or ever been a member of the Communist Party? Arthur Miller had never been a member of the Communist Party. But Arthur Miller knew a lot of people who had been members. And they did call him up there. And, he was very famous at the time. He had the awards. He had all this stuff going for him. And he was like, no, I've never been a member. And then they said, well, do you know anybody who has? And he said, well, I can't say anything about that. I'm not going to cause trouble for other people. And it became this big fight back and forth of, well, you've got to give names. A lot of people had to make decisions at this time. It was not a pretty period in American history. Not that any period's any better than the last one. But HUAC ruined a lot of lives. A lot of people ended up being what we call blacklisted. When you were blacklisted, you could not be gainfully employed. And so you went from, being a writer at a movie studio to the next week you're working at a grocery store stocking food. It goes down very bad. And so we had a lot of people get blacklisted at this time who were fairly good artists. And if you were blacklisted, you couldn't appear in movies, you couldn't appear on television, you couldn't be on the radio. You could still work in the theater because there were so many theaters, you could always find a place that was willing to hire you. But as far as mass media, becoming a movie star or anything, well, that was impossible. And so Miller refused to name names and was basically removed from any chance he had of becoming a person that you would all know today. Now, as a twist of fate, he then wrote The Crucible, which is about the witch trials in Salem. And basically, when the committee called him back, they wanted to know, Mr. Miller, this play, people say, is written about this committee. And he said, well, Senator, an analogy was inevitable. The idea of bringing people in and saying, are you a witch? Do you know anybody who is a witch? Well, tell us the names of the people that you believe might be witches. And John Proctor, the protagonist, is like, there are no witches. And so they begin to torture him because he won't say that there are witches. And basically you find these parallels. And The Crucible is very good in making that connection between the two periods. Miller probably would have went to jail, but at the time all this was happening, he was married to the wealthiest actor in Hollywood. And so hopefully you don't have to figure out that that's Marilyn Monroe. And so she and Miller were married, and so she had the finances to keep him going, even though everything that he was working on was falling apart. And so this is what kept him going all that time, and also brings us to the argument, was Miller a great playwright, even though there's only a couple of plays that we can look at and say, this is phenomenal? Or was he just this really great guy who stood up for things, and now we look back on him and say, yeah, of course he was a great playwright. Look what sort of person he was. And that goes back and forth quite often, I find. But Miller's Death of a Salesman is easily one of those big plays that you have to know. Tennessee Williams is the only writer from the South that we talk about in the American canon. He was born in Mississippi, but he was raised in St. Louis. He was, the underbelly of the playwrights. He wrote, about individuals you weren't going to hang out with. His plays were dirty, whereas Miller's were about the working class not making it, or, we run into O'Neill, and it's about, the family dynamic dealing with, addiction. We run into Miller, and we run into domestic abuse, alcoholism, homosexuality, all these themes that just, were taboo to mention in any way, shape, or form. And so the play that often gets pointed at for him is A Streetcar Named Desire. Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire. That is easily his master work. It came out in 1947. Now, it did win the Pulitzer. It was made into a film. The film, if you watch it, I've said this before in this room, you're not going to understand what the play was about because they cut so much out of the play, because the play was highly controversial in 1947 when it came out. And when they made it into a movie, they had almost the same cast, and they went in there and said, okay, now we're not going to shoot this, we're not going to shoot this. They take out the rape scene, they take out the fact that Blanche's first husband was a homosexual, they take all that stuff out, and by the end you're sitting there going, so why does she have problems? And you don't really have any of those answers. But Tennessee Williams wrote really about the underbelly of American drama. He wrote plays about pedophilia. He wrote plays about, marriages that, should have never occurred in the first place. He wrote plays about, people being married and yet not being attracted in any way, shape, or form to their spouse. It was just the thing they had to do to fit into society. It's about unhappy people living every day unhappily together. And Streetcar Named Desire is an excellent example of that unhappy existence that just goes day by day. In fact, one of the best things about this quote, problems of people to whom one would show the door if they came to one's office. These are not people you want to hang out with. that he is putting in the play. And then the last big name in the American canon is Edward Albee, A-L-B-E-E, Albee. Both Miller and Williams had great careers that were really short as far as productivity. Miller between 1949 and like 1957, almost 10 years, he was doing excellent. And Tennessee Williams between 1947 and 1958, he was at the top of Sweet Bird of Youth, Summer and Smoke, The Rose Tattoo, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, he won a Pulitzer for, so he got 2 to his name. Arthur Miller only ever got 1 because HUAC made sure he was never going to get another. But then we have Edward Albee, and Albee takes over in the 60s. And Albee's career, like Eugene O'Neill's, is going to span decades. Where the others, you can sum them up sometimes in 7 to 10 years. For Albee, his career goes about 50 solid years of producing work that's going to get performed. Same thing with Eugene O'Neill. And remember, Eugene O'Neill's still winning awards when he's dead. And so, some careers just don't stop. Now, there's actually an excellent quote by Albee because he often had problems with critics. His work was very controversial for its time. His first play he ever got out there, A Zoo Story, which is a short play, it definitely, was an oddity. It was very violent. It only lasts about 30 minutes, but in 30 minutes you start with 2 characters, and by the end you got 1. It is not that pretty of a scene. He did win 3 Pulitzers. These are the plays he picked them up for: A Delicate Balance, Three Tall Women, Seascape. Some people refer to Albee as the American absurdist. He is our version of Beckett. He hated that. He didn't want to be compared to Beckett. He didn't think his plays were that odd, but I promise you they were fairly odd. Seascape, he won his first Pulitzer. 2 people are having a picnic on a beach. 2 lizard-like creatures come out of the water, sit down with them. They all talk about relationships. Not exactly, your standard fare. A Delicate Balance, these people have another couple over to their house for dinner. The dinner finishes, and they can't get the people to leave. Goes a little bit odd. And then Three Tall Women, he won a Pulitzer in the 90s for. So, he's winning in the 60s, he's winning in the 90s. Three Tall Women, you have a woman who is elderly, a woman who is middle-aged, and a woman who is just, a teenager, really. And they're having a conversation in a room over their, what you believe is their friend who's passing away. They're on their deathbed. And during their conversation, what you realize is they're actually the woman who's laying in the bed at 3 different times in her life. And they're talking about the decisions that have brought them there. And so, one character is saying, well, why didn't we have children? And the younger one's like, well, we wanted to go to school. We wanted to have a career. And then the older one's like, yeah, but we never had the family that other people had. We could have had this. We could have done this. It's like, yes, but instead we had a career. And so they're talking back and forth about all the decisions that take them to that end. And so he did win these 3 Pulitzers. However, whenever anybody asked him about, how do you feel about the awards you've gotten, and he is the second most awarded playwright we have. If O'Neill's number 1, Albee is number 2. He always told people he had 3.5 Pulitzers, and it's because of this one. We have discussed this play before. Somebody knows why. When have we talked about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in the past? When we discussed the Hays Code and the MPAA and the end of censorship when it comes to films. The Pulitzer has a committee that votes on each different category. So they have a bunch of people who specialize in criticism, and they vote for the Pulitzer in criticism. A bunch of people who are, composers, they vote for the, Pulitzer for composition. Well, there is a group of people who are theater people, and they voted for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to receive the Pulitzer. But when Columbia University, which sponsors the award, saw what the vote was, they came back and said, pick another play. We're not going to give an award to a play that is that obscene. And they got into a big fight back and forth with their committee. A lot of those committee members resigned rather than name another play, and so no award was given in 1963. They just didn't acknowledge anything. And so Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf became famous for not winning the award. All the other major figures we've talked about with their great plays, Long Day's Journey got the award, Death of a Salesman got the award, Streetcar Named Desire got the award. Edward Albee has 3 awards, but you could also argue that they started giving them to him because they were like, yeah, we made a mistake. But Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is the only masterwork by one of these individuals that doesn't have that award sitting on the mantle. But it is easily seen of why in 1963 the committee had problems. The play was considered incredibly obscene, even by Tennessee Williams standards, who was writing stuff like Summer and Smoke about pedophilia, even looked at it and was like, oh my God, they're so mean in this play. And so it was not an easy play to take. All right, folks, we'll get through the roll, and then when we get back, though we have spoken about the big names in American playwriting, none of those individuals wrote in the style of theater that is mostly associated with the United States. What style of theater are we mainly known for?